The Portland courthouse stood like a sentinel of justice on Morrison Street, its granite facade gleaming under the pale November sunlight. Inside, the bustling energy of the legal system was about to collide with something far more powerful, the raw, unfiltered truth of a child's suffering. It was 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and the courtroom of Judge Patricia Morrison was packed with an unusual number of spectators. The gallery benches creaked under the weight of reporters, concerned citizens, social workers, and family members, all drawn by whispers of a high-profile custody case that had captured the attention of Portland's tight-knit community. Judge Patricia Morrison herself was a formidable presence, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a pristine bun and eyes that missed nothing. She had presided over the Oregon family court system for nearly 2 decades, and her reputation was legendary. She was known for her sharp intellect, her unwavering commitment to the best interests of children, and her ability to see through deception with almost supernatural accuracy. Today, she sat elevated behind her mahogany bench, her black robes perfectly draped, her expression grave and focused. She had reviewed the case files extensively over the past 3 weeks, and what she had read disturbed her deeply. At the witness stand stood Detective Sarah Chen, a lean, athletic woman in her mid-40s with sharp features and intelligent dark eyes. She had been a police officer for 17 years, the last 8 of which she had spent as a K-9 unit detective. Her record was impeccable: 43 successful cases, 0 wrongful convictions overturned, and the highest commendation rate in her precinct. Today, she was about to testify about one of the most confusing investigations of her career. Beside her, calm and perfectly composed, lay Rex, a magnificent 5-year-old German shepherd with a glossy black and tan coat that seemed to shimmer under the courtroom lights. Rex had been her partner for 6 years, and their bond was the kind that transcended the typical human-animal relationship. Rex could read Sarah's emotional state from a single glance, and he responded with an intuitive understanding that bordered on the supernatural. The case itself was a tangled mess of allegations, counter-allegations, and conflicting testimonies. At its heart was a 3-year-old girl named Emma Hartwell, a small, blonde child with pale blue eyes that had seen far too much for someone her age. Emma was sitting at a specially designed child-sized table in the middle of the courtroom, positioned so that she could see both her parents but remain a safe distance from them. She was clutching a worn stuffed rabbit that had been with her since infancy, its once white fur now stained and matted, one ear hanging by a thread, but clearly beloved and cherished. The rabbit was her anchor, her connection to something safe and unchanging in a world that had become increasingly unpredictable and frightening. Emma's mother, Jennifer Hartwell, sat in the front row on the left side of the courtroom, behind the prosecution table. She was a petite woman in her early 30s, with the kind of beauty that came from inner strength rather than superficial features. Her light brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a modest navy dress that spoke of respect for the courtroom rather than an attempt to impress. Her face was ravaged by worry and exhaustion, the kind of worry that only a mother can feel when her child's safety and future hang in the balance. She had been crying regularly for weeks, her eyes perpetually red and swollen, and today was no exception. She clutched a tissue in one hand and her daughter's welfare report in the other, as if the documents themselves might provide her with strength. On the opposite side of the courtroom, behind the defense table, sat Marcus Hartwell, Emma's father. He was a tall man in his mid-30s with the kind of handsome features that came easily to him, the kind of looks that had probably charmed Jennifer into falling in love with him years ago. But today, those features were twisted into an expression of cold calculation. His suit was expensive, tailored perfectly, and his lawyer, a shark of a man named Richard Pemberton, sat beside him, whispering strategy. Marcus had not once made eye contact with Emma since the proceedings began. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his cheeks were visibly flexed. Occasionally, his eyes would dart toward Jennifer with an expression of pure contempt, as if her presence in this courtroom was the ultimate betrayal. The allegations against Marcus were serious. Emma's preschool teacher, a woman named Margaret Sullivan, had noticed disturbing changes in the child's behavior over the past 6 months. Emma, who had once been bright and talkative, had become withdrawn and anxious. She flinched at loud noises. She had nightmares. She displayed unusual knowledge about adult conflict and anger that no 3-year-old should possess. Most alarmingly, Margaret had discovered bruises on Emma's small arms, bruises that didn't match the explanations offered by Marcus, who insisted they were the result of normal childhood play and accidents. Detective Sarah Chen had been called to investigate, and that was when everything had become strange. The initial welfare check at the Hartwell residence had revealed a home that was meticulously clean and organized, almost obsessively so. Marcus had been cooperative, almost too cooperative, answering questions with the kind of precision that suggested he had rehearsed his responses. But Rex had behaved in a way that Sarah had never witnessed in 6 years of partnership. The dog had entered the home with his usual calm professionalism, but upon seeing Emma, he had made a direct line toward the child and refused to move from her side. When Marcus had commanded the dog to move, Rex had actually positioned himself more protectively around the girl, his body language shifting from neutral to subtly defensive. That moment, that single, inexplicable moment, had sparked Sarah's deeper investigation. She had requested additional welfare checks, had coordinated with the school, had interviewed neighbors, and had slowly built a case that suggested something troubling was happening in that home. Text messages discovered between Marcus and friends contained casual references to disciplining Emma, to her needing to learn respect, to her being defiant and mouthy. While individually these messages might have meant nothing, together they painted a picture of a man who viewed a 3-year-old child as an adversary to be conquered rather than a human being to be nurtured. Now, in this courtroom, that investigation had culminated in this custody hearing. The prosecution wanted full custody transferred to Jennifer, with Marcus receiving only supervised visitation. The defense wanted to discredit the investigation, paint Jennifer as an alienating mother trying to manipulate the system, and retain joint custody with significant parenting time for Marcus. And in the middle of this legal battlefield stood Emma, a child who couldn't fully articulate what was happening to her, whose only witnesses were the traces of trauma visible in her behavior and her small body. The courtroom had been in session for 3 hours already. The defense attorney, Richard Pemberton, had been systematically attacking Detective Chen's credibility, suggesting that her conclusions were biased, that she had allowed her emotional attachment to Emma to cloud her judgment, that a dog's behavior couldn't possibly constitute reliable evidence of anything. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating, the air thick with unresolved conflict and the weight of a child's future hanging in the balance. Every person present understood the gravity of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just another family court case. This was a battle for the soul and safety of a small human being who couldn't fight for herself. Judge Morrison's expression remained stern and focused, but her eyes occasionally drifted to Emma, watching the child's reactions, gauging her emotional state, trying to read the truth written in the body language of a 3-year-old who had learned far too early that the world could be a place of pain and confusion. The judge had seen many cases in her career, but something about this one felt different, felt more urgent, felt like the stakes were higher than usual. And then, as the defense attorney continued his relentless questioning, something unprecedented was about to happen, something that would change the entire trajectory of this case and reveal a truth that no amount of legal argument could deny. The defense attorney, Richard Pemberton, was in his element. He paced back and forth in front of Detective Chen like a predator circling wounded prey, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished courtroom floor. He was a man of average height but commanding presence, with slick-back gray hair and the kind of confidence that came from winning more cases than he had lost. His voice was sharp, almost cutting, designed to needle and provoke rather than to genuinely seek information. For the past 40 minutes, he had been systematically dismantling Detective Chen's testimony, point by point, insinuation by insinuation. "Detective Chen," Pemberton said, his tone dripping with false civility, "you testified that your dog, Rex, is that correct? Displayed what you termed protective behavior toward my client's daughter. Isn't it true that German Shepherds are bred for protective behavior? Isn't that their entire purpose? That they display protective instincts toward virtually anyone, especially children?" Sarah Chen maintained her composure, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She had been trained extensively for hostile cross-examination. "That's partially true, Mr. Pemberton. However, Rex's behavior during that initial welfare check was distinctly different from his normal response patterns. He had met hundreds of children in his career as a police dog. His reaction to Emma was unprecedented." "Unprecedented," Pemberton repeated, drawing out the word mockingly. "A convenient term for behavior that you interpreted subjectively, wouldn't you say? After all, you're not a dog behaviorist, are you, detective?" Before Sarah could respond, something extraordinary happened. Emma, who had been sitting quietly at her small table, suddenly lurched upright in her chair. Her tiny hands gripped the edge of the table so forcefully that her knuckles turned white. Her entire small body had gone rigid, her pale blue eyes wide and intensely focused, locked directly on Rex with a concentration that seemed almost supernatural for a 3-year-old child. The change was so dramatic and sudden that it rippled through the entire courtroom like an electric shock. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Reporters' hands froze over their notepads. The court stenographer's fingers paused above her keyboard. Even Judge Morrison, who had spent decades maintaining judicial composure, leaned forward with surprise evident on her face. Emma's court-appointed child advocate, a woman named Patricia Summers who specialized in representing child victims, immediately placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "Emma, honey, it's okay. Please sit down," Patricia said softly, her voice soothing and trained to calm anxious children. But Emma didn't respond to the guidance. Her entire being seemed magnetized toward the German Shepherd, every muscle in her tiny body trembling with barely contained emotion. She resisted Patricia's gentle attempt to seat her, her resistance surprising for such a small child. Jennifer Hartwell, watching from her seat in the gallery, suddenly gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears instantaneously. She half rose from her seat, as if preparing to move toward her daughter, but the bailiff gave her a warning look that kept her in place. Jennifer's body was shaking visibly, her entire frame vibrating with maternal concern and something else, something that looked like recognition, like understanding, like a piece of a puzzle suddenly clicking into place. Marcus Hartwell's reaction was entirely different. His face flushed a deep crimson, the color spreading from his neck upward like a rising tide. His hands clenched into fists beneath the table, so tightly that his knuckles went white and the veins in his forearms became visibly prominent. His jaw clenched even more tightly than before, creating a muscle spasm in his cheek. He leaned over and whispered something urgent and angry to his attorney, Richard Pemberton, whose own expression shifted from confident to uncertain within milliseconds. Richard Pemberton held up his hands in a placating gesture toward the bench. "Your Honor, if I may continue my examination." Judge Patricia Morrison raised her own hand, silencing him with the kind of quiet authority that came from someone accustomed to being obeyed. Her gray eyes, sharp and penetrating, fixed directly on the small blonde child standing in front of her table. "One moment, Mr. Pemberton," the judge said, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of intense interest. She looked directly at Emma, her expression softening into something almost grandmotherly, though her eyes remained sharp and assessing. "Emma, sweetheart, I want you to know that you're safe here in this courtroom. Do you understand that?" Emma nodded slightly, though her gaze never wavered from Rex. The dog, for his part, seemed to sense the shift in the room's energy. He remained perfectly still, his body language calm and composed, his dark, intelligent eyes fixed on the small girl with an expression that could only be described as understanding and compassion. His tail, which normally moved with unconscious rhythm, was now completely still. It was as if Rex understood that this moment mattered profoundly, that his every action and reaction was being witnessed and would have consequences. "Emma," Judge Morrison continued, her voice gentle but clear, "would you like to tell us something? Is there something you want to say?" The courtroom had become so silent that you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath simultaneously, waiting, anticipating, sensing that something momentous was about to occur. Emma's lips parted slightly. Her tiny chin trembled. Her small fingers unclenched from the table edge and reached out, stretching across the distance between herself and Rex, as if she were physically reaching toward safety itself. Patricia Summers, the child advocate, leaned down closer to Emma. "It's okay, Emma. You can speak. Whatever you want to say, it's safe to say it here." Emma took a shaky breath. Her eyes were glistening with moisture. Whether from tears, excitement, or fear was impossible to determine. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was barely above a whisper, so quiet that several people in the gallery leaned forward to hear better. The court stenographer had to adjust her microphone to catch the words. But those words, those two simple, seemingly innocuous words, would reverberate through the courtroom with the force of an explosion. Those two words would become the turning point of the entire case. Those two words would prove that sometimes the most profound truths cannot be hidden behind legal maneuvering, behind careful testimony, behind the sophisticated architecture of the legal system itself. Emma pointed directly at Rex, her small arm extended, her voice trembling but growing slightly stronger with each repetition. "Good dog," she whispered. Then, gathering courage from somewhere deep within her small body, she said it again, louder this time. "Good dog, good dog." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Jennifer Hartwell gasped so sharply that several people turned to look at her, concerned she might be having a medical emergency. Her face had gone pale, then flushed, tears streaming down her cheeks in torrents. She covered her mouth with both hands, her entire body shaking with emotion so powerful it seemed to threaten to overwhelm her completely. Marcus Hartwell's face transformed into something almost unrecognizable. His expression cycled rapidly through shock, anger, fear, and calculation, as if his mind was desperately trying to process what was happening and formulate a response. His attorney leaned over and hissed something urgent in his ear, something that made Marcus nod jerkily, his jaw clenching and unclenching repeatedly. Judge Morrison's gavel came down once sharply, commanding silence. "Order, order in this courtroom. I will have order." But even as the judge was restoring order, even as the bailiff was moving to calm the gallery, even as reporters were frantically scribbling notes, Detective Sarah Chen's eyes had widened with sudden, crystalline understanding. She had just remembered something crucial, something that connected all the disparate pieces of this case into a coherent whole. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she exchanged a meaningful glance with Rex, who seemed to understand perfectly what had just transpired and what it meant. The two words hung in the air like a confession, like an accusation, like evidence itself. And everyone in that courtroom, from the judge to the stenographer to the reporters in the gallery, understood that everything had just changed in ways that the legal system might struggle to articulate but could never deny. The silence that followed Emma's declaration was profound and absolute, the kind of silence that seems to compress time itself. Every person in the courtroom, from the judge to the bailiff to the reporters clutching their notepads, seemed suspended in a moment of crystalline understanding. Those two words, "good dog," spoken by a 3-year-old girl in a voice barely above a whisper, carried the weight of revelation. They weren't just words, they were a statement of fact, a beacon of truth cutting through the fog of legal argument and sophisticated testimony. Emma continued to point at Rex, her small arm unwavering, her voice growing stronger with each repetition. "Good dog, good dog, good dog." The desperation in her voice escalated with each utterance, as if she were trying to communicate something far more complex and profound than the simple phrase itself could convey. It was the voice of a child who had finally found a way to express something that had been locked inside her for months, something that had been festering in her small soul, something that had been struggling to break free. Judge Patricia Morrison sat motionless for a moment, her weathered face an unreadable mask of concentration. She had presided over hundreds of cases involving children, and her instincts, honed by decades of experience, were screaming at her that she was witnessing something extraordinary. The judge's gray eyes moved from Emma to Rex to Detective Chen and back again, processing, analyzing, understanding. Then, with the kind of deliberate precision that defined her judicial style, she raised her gavel and brought it down once more, commanding absolute silence. "Everyone will remain silent," Judge Morrison announced, her voice crisp and authoritative. "I will not tolerate any disruption whatsoever. Court stenographer, please ensure that every word being spoken is recorded. We are now in the presence of a potentially critical moment in this proceeding." Jennifer Hartwell, Emma's mother, had risen partially from her seat, her entire body trembling violently. Her face had transformed from the worried, exhausted expression she had worn all morning into something raw and primal, a mixture of hope, fear, vindication, and overwhelming maternal emotion. She was pressing her knuckles against her mouth so hard that her lips had turned white, her eyes streaming tears that flowed so abundantly they seemed almost biblical in their intensity. Several times she appeared ready to move toward her daughter, and each time the bailiff's warning glance kept her frozen in place, a prisoner of courtroom protocol when every maternal instinct was screaming at her to run to Emma and hold her. "Jennifer, you must remain seated," Judge Morrison said firmly, though not unkindly. The judge understood the power of a mother's love. She simply needed to maintain order. "You will have your opportunity to embrace your daughter, but not during these proceedings." Marcus Hartwell, by contrast, had become deathly pale, the color draining from his face as if someone had opened a valve and let his confidence bleed out onto the courtroom floor. His expensive suit, which had looked so sharp and commanding just moments before, now seemed to hang on him like a costume that no longer fit. His attorney, Richard Pemberton, had stopped whispering strategy and had instead leaned back in his chair, his face a study in professional consternation. The attorney's sharp features had softened into an expression of dawning realization that the case he had been so confidently defending had just fundamentally shifted beneath him. Detective Sarah Chen's reaction was different still. She sat very still, her dark eyes fixed on Emma with an intensity that suggested she was experiencing a moment of profound personal significance. Her hand had unconsciously reached down and found Rex's head, her fingers sinking into the dog's soft fur in a gesture that was half comfort and half confirmation. Sarah's lips had parted slightly, and her breathing had become shallow and rapid, the physical manifestations of someone experiencing an adrenaline surge of significant proportions. Emma, seemingly unaware of the seismic shift her words had created, continued to gaze at Rex with an expression of almost desperate longing. The dog, for his part, remained absolutely motionless, his dark, intelligent eyes locked on the small girl with an expression that transcended the typical human-animal relationship. It was as if Rex understood in some primal and ancient way that his behavior in this moment was critical. His tail, which normally moved with unconscious rhythm throughout the day, remained perfectly still against the floor. His breathing was measured and calm. Every muscle in his body projected an aura of reassurance and protection. "Emma," Judge Morrison said gently, her voice taking on a different quality, still authoritative but now infused with genuine compassion. "Emma, sweetheart, can you tell us more about the dog? Can you tell us what you mean when you say, 'good dog'?" Emma's gaze flickered briefly toward the judge, then immediately returned to Rex, as if looking away from the dog for more than a few seconds was physically painful for her. Her small mouth opened and closed several times, as if she were struggling to translate thoughts and feelings into words, a task that seemed almost impossibly difficult for a 3-year-old child processing complex emotions. He was there, Emma finally managed, her voice small and uncertain, each word seeming to require enormous effort to produce. When Daddy was loud, he was there. The courtroom reacted to this statement as if it were a bomb detonating. Jennifer Hartwell let out a small sound that was halfway between a gasp and a sob. Marcus Hartwell's hands suddenly clenched into fists so tight that his entire forearms shook with the tension. Richard Pemberton's face had gone white, and he was already leaning toward his client, whispering urgently, clearly attempting damage control for a defense that was unraveling in real time. "Emma, I need you to be very clear about something," Judge Morrison continued, her judicial demeanor reasserting itself even as her eyes remained warm. "When you say your daddy was loud, do you mean he was yelling? Was he angry?" Emma nodded vigorously, her small blonde head moving up and down with the kind of certainty that only a child could muster when describing something they had experienced directly. "He yelled lots. He yelled at Mommy. He yelled at me. He said bad words." Her voice had taken on a quality of recitation, as if she were describing events that had been seared into her memory with terrible clarity. Patricia Summers, the child advocate, placed a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. "It's okay, Emma. You're being very brave. You're telling the truth, and that's what's important." "And the dog?" Judge Morrison pressed forward gently. "What did the dog do when your daddy was yelling?" Emma's entire face seemed to transform at this question. Her expression, which had been anxious and uncertain, shifted into something resembling peace. "He came to me," she said softly. "He put his head on my leg. He stayed with me. He made me not scared." The courtroom had become so quiet that you could hear the faint electrical hum of the overhead lights, the subtle sounds of people breathing, the barely perceptible rustle of fabric as someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Every single person present understood that they were witnessing something profoundly important, a moment when a child's simple truth was cutting through months of legal argument and sophisticated maneuvering like a knife through silk. Richard Pemberton was on his feet, his professional composure cracking visibly. "Your Honor, I must object. This line of questioning is highly leading and suggestive. The child is clearly being coached by the implication in the judge's questions. This is entirely improper." Judge Morrison's eyes flashed with something cold and dangerous. "Mr. Pemberton, I would suggest that you sit down and remain silent unless you have a legitimate legal objection. Coaching a child would indeed be improper, but so is attempting to silence a child's testimony when she is spontaneously providing information relevant to this case. Now, you will sit down." It was not a suggestion. Richard Pemberton sat down immediately, his face flushed with a combination of anger and frustration at a situation spiraling beyond his control. Emma, seemingly oblivious to the legal drama unfolding around her, had turned her full attention back to Rex. She took a tentative step toward the dog, then another, her small bare feet moving across the courtroom floor. Patricia Summers didn't attempt to stop her. Something in the moment demanded that this child be allowed to move toward the source of her comfort. When Emma reached Rex, the dog's tail finally moved, not with exuberant wagging, but with a slow, deliberate motion that suggested profound understanding. Emma reached out her tiny hand and placed it on Rex's head, stroking his soft fur with the kind of tender gratitude that seemed to transcend language itself. "Thank you for being good," Emma whispered, so quietly that only those closest to her could hear. "Thank you for helping me." And in that single moment, with those simple words spoken by a 3-year-old to a police dog, the entire case shifted irrevocably. The carefully constructed defense, the sophisticated legal arguments, the strategic maneuvering, all of it seemed suddenly and profoundly irrelevant. Truth, in its most basic and undeniable form, had entered the courtroom, and it could not be argued away, cross-examined, or dismissed by any amount of legal expertise. Detective Sarah Chen sat motionless at the witness stand, her dark eyes fixed on the interaction between Emma and Rex, her mind racing through a labyrinth of memories and realizations. Something had triggered in her consciousness, a fragment of recollection from 3 months earlier that suddenly seemed to hold the key to understanding everything that was happening in this courtroom at this very moment. Her fingers tightened slightly in Rex's fur, and her breathing became shallow and controlled, the way it always did when she was processing information of critical importance. 3 months ago, November, the initial welfare check, the phone call from Margaret Sullivan, Emma's preschool teacher, reporting concerns about bruising and behavioral changes. Sarah had responded personally, bringing Rex along as she did with most of her investigations. It had been a routine call, or so she had thought at the time. Nothing remarkable, nothing that stood out as extraordinary compared to the hundreds of other welfare checks she had conducted throughout her career. But now, sitting in this courtroom, watching Emma stroke Rex's head with such obvious affection and trust, the memories came flooding back with crystalline clarity. Sarah could see it now as vividly as if it were happening in real time. She and Rex had arrived at the Hartwell residence on a gray afternoon in August, the kind of Portland day where the sky hung low and heavy, threatening rain that might or might not materialize. The apartment building was a modest 3-story structure in a middle-class neighborhood, the kind of place where families struggled to make ends meet, where rent consumed a significant portion of paychecks, where the walls were thin enough that neighbors' arguments bled through into adjacent units. Marcus had answered the door almost immediately, his demeanor carefully constructed to project cooperation and innocence. He was friendly, smiling, the kind of performance that had probably fooled many people throughout his life. He had invited them inside, gesturing expansively around the meticulously clean apartment. Every surface had been spotless, almost obsessively so. The floors gleamed with fresh polish. The furniture was arranged with geometric precision. Even the books on the shelves were organized by height and color, a level of orderliness that suggested either a compulsively neat person or someone preparing for inspection. "Please come in," Marcus had said, his voice warm and welcoming. "I'm sure this is all some kind of misunderstanding. Emma is fine. She's a happy, healthy child." But then Emma had emerged from her bedroom, and everything had changed. Sarah remembered the moment with perfect clarity. The 3-year-old girl had appeared in the doorway wearing a small pink dress, her pale blonde hair tousled, her expression cautious and uncertain. She had seen her father and her body had visibly tensed. Then she had seen Rex, and something entirely different had happened. Her eyes had widened, not with fear, but with something that could only be described as recognition and relief. Rex, in that moment, had done something Sarah had never witnessed in 6 years of partnership. The dog, who had been trained extensively in police work, who maintained professional composure in virtually every situation, who could ignore distractions and focus on his handler's directions with laser-like precision, Rex had abandoned protocol entirely. Without waiting for Sarah's command, without acknowledging her presence, the dog had moved directly toward Emma. Not in an aggressive manner, not with anything resembling threat, but with a purposefulness that bordered on the instinctive. Marcus had noticed the dog's movement and had immediately attempted to redirect it. "Hey, get the dog away from her," he had said, his friendly demeanor slipping for just a moment before he caught himself. I'm not sure if the child should be around a police dog. Isn't that a liability issue?" But Rex had paid no attention to the request. The dog had positioned himself directly beside Emma, his massive head at exactly the right height so that, when he gently pressed his face against her small body, he was offering comfort without imposing threat. Emma had immediately wrapped her tiny arms around the dog's neck, burying her small face in his fur, and her entire body had seemed to relax in a way that suggested she had finally found something safe in an unsafe world. Sarah had noticed something else in that moment, a subtle but unmistakable change in Marcus's demeanor. His friendly smile had faltered, his eyes had narrowed, a muscle in his jaw had twitched, and in that fleeting moment before he had carefully reconstructed his expression, Sarah had glimpsed something else entirely. She had glimpsed anger. She had glimpsed resentment at the dog's presence. She had glimpsed something that looked remarkably like possessiveness, as if Marcus resented anything or anyone offering comfort to Emma that didn't originate from him. "She needs to come here," Marcus had said, his voice taking on a different quality, slightly harder, slightly more commanding. "Emma, come away from the dog. Now." But Emma had not moved. She had remained pressed against Rex, her small fingers digging into his fur, her entire body language screaming refusal. And Rex, seemingly understanding the gravity of the situation, had refused to move as well. The dog had simply remained in place, his body a protective barrier between the child and her father, his steady presence communicating something that no words could express. That was when Sarah's investigative instincts had begun to sound alarms. She had seen many children throughout her career, had witnessed countless interactions between adults and children, and she understood the language of trauma and fear in ways that transcended professional training. She had understood in that moment that whatever Marcus was telling her about Emma being happy and healthy was a lie. She had understood that Rex's behavior, unprecedented as it was communicating a truth that Emma herself couldn't articulate. "Detective, is your dog always like this?" Marcus had asked, his voice now tinged with frustration. "Doesn't he listen to commands? Shouldn't you be able to control him?" Sarah had made a decision in that moment that would eventually lead to this courtroom, to this testimony, to this pivotal moment where a child's truth was finally breaking through the surface. She had decided that Rex's instincts took precedence over Marcus's complaints. She had decided that a dog's understanding of a child's emotional state was more reliable than an adult's careful explanations. She had decided to trust her partner in ways she had never had to before. "He's fine," Sarah had said calmly. "He's responding to Emma's emotional needs. Sometimes dogs are better at understanding what children need than we are." Marcus had not responded well to this statement. His face had flushed. His hands had clenched into fists. For a moment, Sarah had thought he might become physically aggressive, and her hand had instinctively moved closer to her service weapon. But then, with visible effort, Marcus had controlled himself, smoothing his expression, forcing a laugh that sounded entirely artificial. "Well, Emma clearly loves dogs," he had said, though his tone suggested the opposite of what his words claimed. "She'll get over it." But something about that moment, something about the way Marcus had said, "she'll get over it," as if Emma's emotional attachment to the dog was an inconvenience to be overcome rather than a source of comfort to be encouraged, had solidified Sarah's determination to investigate more deeply. She had requested additional welfare checks. She had coordinated with the preschool. She had interviewed neighbors who had mentioned hearing raised voices and arguments coming from the Hartwell apartment late at night. And now, 3 months later, sitting in this courtroom watching Emma stroke Rex's head, while whispering gratitude to the dog who had understood her pain before anyone else could, Sarah understood completely what Rex had known all along. The dog hadn't been responding to general distress signals. The dog had been responding to a specific child in a specific situation, recognizing something in Emma that demanded protection and comfort. Judge Morrison, observing Sarah's expression, seemed to understand that something significant had just occurred in the detective's memory. The judge leaned forward slightly, her sharp gray eyes narrowing with acute interest. "Detective Chen," Judge Morrison said carefully, "it appears you have just realized something related to your previous interaction with Emma. Would you care to share that realization with the court?" Sarah took a deep breath, her hand still resting on Rex's head. She looked directly at the judge, then at Emma, then at Rex, and finally at the record that was being meticulously transcribed by the court stenographer. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. I have just remembered something from the initial welfare check conducted 3 months ago, something that I believe is directly relevant to understanding what Emma has just communicated to this court." Judge Patricia Morrison leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled together in a gesture of intense concentration. The courtroom had become so silent that even the ambient sounds of the building seemed muted. No footsteps in the hallway outside, no distant conversations, no mechanical hum of air conditioning. It was as if the entire world had paused to witness this moment of revelation. "Please proceed, Detective Chen," Judge Morrison commanded, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "Tell this court what you have remembered." Sarah Chen took a moment to collect her thoughts, her professional demeanor reasserting itself even as her emotional response to the situation remained clearly visible in her eyes. She had testified in court hundreds of times, had delivered reports and findings with clinical precision, but this felt different. This felt personal. This felt like a moment where her partnership with Rex would either be vindicated or dismissed as the subjective interpretation of a biased observer. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice steady and measured, "during the initial welfare check at the Hartwell residence 3 months ago, I brought Rex with me, as is standard procedure in my investigations. When we arrived, I observed Mr. Hartwell's demeanor was cooperative, perhaps overly so. He answered questions readily, invited us into his home, and maintained what appeared to be a composed and friendly presentation." She paused, allowing her words to settle into the record, ensuring the stenographer was capturing every nuance. However, when Emma emerged from her room, Rex's behavior underwent a dramatic transformation. Without any command from me, without any indication from the environment that would typically trigger his protective responses, Rex moved directly to Emma and positioned himself in a protective manner. Most significantly, when Mr. Hartwell attempted to redirect the dog away from Emma, Rex refused to comply. This behavior was unprecedented in my 6 years of partnership with this dog. Richard Pemberton shifted in his seat, preparing to object, but Judge Morrison raised her hand, silencing him before he could speak. "I'm going to allow the detective to finish her statement," the judge announced. "Your objections can be noted for the record, Mr. Pemberton, but you will allow Detective Chen to complete her testimony without interruption." Sarah continued, her words now taking on a more passionate quality. "What I observed in that moment was not random dog behavior. What I observed was a dog responding to something he sensed in a child, a recognition of distress, of fear, of a need for protection that transcended normal social interaction. Dogs are creatures of remarkable intuition. They can detect human emotional states through micro-expressions, through pheromone changes, through subtle shifts in body language that humans cannot consciously perceive. And in that moment, Rex was telling me something that Emma couldn't articulate, that this child needed help." She looked directly at Emma, who had returned to her seat at the small table, though her eyes remained fixed on Rex with an intensity that suggested the dog was her anchor in an uncertain world. That moment initiated a deeper investigation. I requested additional welfare checks. I interviewed Emma's preschool teacher extensively. I collected reports from neighbors about arguments and raised voices heard from the Hartwell residents. I reviewed text messages and communications between Mr. Hartwell and his associates, and I began to construct a picture of a man whose treatment of his daughter suggested patterns of emotional abuse and inappropriate discipline. At this point, Dr. Judith Morris, the court-appointed child psychologist, requested permission to address the bench. Judge Morrison granted it with a nod, and Dr. Morris stood, moving to a position where she could be clearly heard and seen by all parties in the courtroom. Dr. Judith Morris was a woman in her early 50s with steel-gray hair, and the kind of compassionate but unflinching expression that came from decades of working with traumatized children. She wore simple, professional clothing that communicated competence without ostentation, a gray blazer over a white blouse, minimal jewelry, sensible shoes. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, and they had witnessed horrors and triumphs in equal measure throughout her career. "Your Honor," Dr. Morris began, her voice carrying the authority of professional expertise, "I have spent the past 8 weeks conducting extensive interviews with Emma Hartwell. I have utilized play therapy, drawing exercises, narrative techniques, and multiple assessment tools designed to evaluate trauma in young children. The results of these evaluations paint a deeply concerning picture." She paused, allowing the weight of her statement to settle over the courtroom. "Emma presents with classic indicators of emotional abuse and potentially physical abuse. She displays elevated anxiety responses to loud noises and raised voices. She exhibits signs of developmental regression, behaviors typical of younger children that she has reverted to as a coping mechanism. She demonstrates hypervigilance regarding adult emotional states, suggesting she has learned to monitor the mood and demeanor of caregivers for signs of danger. She utilizes avoidance and dissociation as defense mechanisms." Richard Pemberton attempted to interrupt, but Judge Morrison silenced him with a look. "However," Dr. Morris continued, "what I found most significant during my evaluations was Emma's remarkable lack of verbal disclosure. She has been unable, or perhaps unwilling, to articulate the specific circumstances that have created her trauma. This is not uncommon in young children, particularly when the source of trauma is a primary caregiver. Children develop intense loyalty to their parents, even when those parents are causing them harm. The cognitive dissonance between love for a parent and fear of that parent creates a kind of psychological paralysis." She adjusted her position slightly, her eyes now focused directly on Judge Morrison. "Until this morning, I had been unable to break through that paralysis. Emma's anxiety and fear prevented her from verbally expressing what she had experienced. However, Detective Chen and Rex provided something that weeks of professional intervention could not. They provided Emma with a reference point of safety. The dog's presence in this courtroom, and more importantly, Emma's recognition of the dog as a source of protection and comfort, appears to have unlocked something in the child's psychological framework." Dr. Morris turned her attention to Emma, her expression softening into something almost grandmotherly. "Emma, in our sessions together, you were very quiet, very withdrawn. But today, when you saw the dog, you found your voice. Can you tell Dr. Morris why the dog is a good dog?" Emma's small face scrunched with the effort of concentration. Her fingers resumed stroking Rex's fur, and the dog's continued calm presence seemed to provide the emotional scaffolding she needed to speak. Because he didn't yell," Emma said slowly, her words coming with difficulty, each phrase seeming to require enormous effort. "Because he was nice. Because when Daddy yelled and yelled, the doggy was nice. He made me feel safe." The courtroom reacted with barely suppressed emotion. Jennifer Hartwell was openly weeping now, her entire frame shaking with sobs that she was attempting to suppress out of respect for courtroom protocol. Several jury members, had there been a jury in this bench trial, would have been struggling with their own emotional responses. "Emma," Dr. Morris pressed forward gently, "when your daddy yelled, what did he yell about?" Emma's eyes filled with tears and her voice became even smaller. "He yelled that I was bad, that I was stupid, that I didn't listen, that Mommy was trying to take me away." Her small hands clenched and she buried her face briefly in Rex's fur. "He said the dog was trying to steal me. He said I wasn't allowed to love the dog." The implications of this statement rippled through the courtroom like a seismic wave. What Emma had just articulated was not random anger or frustrated parenting. What she had described was a systematic campaign of emotional abuse designed to isolate her, control her, and dominate her psychologically. The reference to the dog trying to steal her revealed something even more disturbing: Marcus's possessiveness, his need for complete control, his resentment of anything or anyone that competed for Emma's affection or loyalty. Dr. Morris's professional demeanor remained steady, though her eyes had hardened with the kind of anger that comes from witnessing child abuse. "Thank you for being very brave and telling us the truth, Emma. You're helping many people understand what's been happening, and that's very important." She turned back to address the bench. "Your Honor, what Emma has just articulated, combined with Detective Chen's observations and the pattern of communications I have reviewed in the case file, indicates a clear and persistent pattern of psychological abuse. This is not a case of a parent who has made mistakes or lost his temper occasionally. This is a case of deliberate, systematic emotional abuse designed to control and dominate a child." Richard Pemberton was on his feet, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "Your Honor, I must strenuously object to this characterization. Dr. Morris is making conclusions based on the leading questions of Detective Chen and on the uncorroborated statements of a traumatized 3-year-old child who is clearly being emotionally manipulated by the presence of a dog in this courtroom." Judge Morrison's gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the room like a gunshot. "Mr. Pemberton, you will sit down. You will remain silent, and you will refrain from making accusations of manipulation in this courtroom unless you have concrete evidence to support such claims. What I am witnessing is a child finally finding the courage to speak truth that has been trapped inside her for months." The judge's eyes were blazing with barely contained fury. In her 2 decades on the bench, Judge Morrison had seen many cases of abuse, many instances of adults manipulating systems designed to protect children. But she had also developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between genuine trauma and fabricated claims. And everything she was witnessing this morning, Emma's behavior, her response to Rex, her fragmented but heartfelt descriptions of her father's emotional abuse, all of it bore the unmistakable hallmark of authentic trauma. "Dr. Morris," Judge Morrison continued, her voice sharp and focused, "in your professional opinion, what does Emma's spontaneous identification of the dog and her expressed gratitude toward the dog indicate about her overall emotional state and her need for protection?" Dr. Morris took a moment to formulate her response, understanding that her words would carry significant weight in the judge's eventual ruling. "Your Honor, Emma's response to the dog indicates several critical things. First, it demonstrates her capacity to recognize safety and protection when it is offered. Second, it shows that she retains the ability to form healthy attachments and to express gratitude and affection appropriately. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it indicates that she is capable of truth-telling when she feels sufficiently safe to do so. The dog has provided her with that sense of safety." The psychologist paused, her eyes fixed on the judge's face. "In my professional opinion, continued exposure to Mr. Hartwell represents a significant risk to Emma's psychological development and overall well-being. She requires a stable, nurturing environment where she can begin to process and heal from the trauma she has experienced. She requires a primary caregiver who is invested in her emotional health rather than in controlling her psychologically. And she requires the understanding that her expressions of emotion and preference, including her affection for a dog, are valid and should be encouraged rather than suppressed or punished." Judge Morrison nodded slowly, absorbing every word, every nuance, every implication of what Dr. Morris had articulated. "Thank you, Dr. Morris. Your testimony is noted and will be given significant weight in my deliberations." Judge Patricia Morrison studied the courtroom with the calm deliberation of a chess master surveying the board after a decisive move. The emotional temperature of the room had shifted dramatically. The energy that had previously favored the defense now tilted decisively toward revelation and truth. The judge understood that what was happening here transcended the typical parameters of a custody hearing. She was witnessing not just the presentation of evidence, but the unfolding of a child's journey from silence to voice, from fear to safety, from isolation to connection. "I believe we need to take a recess at this time," Judge Morrison announced, her gavel poised but not yet struck. However, before we do, I am going to order something that is highly unusual in custody proceedings. I want to facilitate a private session with Emma, her child advocate, Dr. Morris, Detective Chen, and the dog in my chambers. This session will be recorded by the court stenographer for the record, but it will remain confidential unless I determine that its contents are relevant to my final ruling. Richard Pemberton erupted from his seat, his face purple with fury and desperation. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. My client has the right to be present during any evaluation of the child. You cannot unilaterally exclude him from proceedings that will directly impact custody determinations. Judge Morrison's gray eyes flashed with a cold intelligence that seemed to freeze the defense attorney mid-protest. Mr. Pemberton, your client's presence would be counterproductive to the purpose of this session, which is to allow Emma to express herself in an environment free from intimidation or fear. You may file an appeal if you believe my ruling is in error. Until then, you will respect this order. It was not a request. Richard Pemberton sank back into his chair, his face a storm of suppressed rage and professional frustration. He leaned toward Marcus and whispered urgently, his words inaudible to those more than a few feet away, but his body language communicating clearly that he was attempting damage control for a defense that was rapidly deteriorating. 15 minutes later, Detective Sarah Chen, Emma, Patricia Summers, the child advocate, Dr. Judith Morris, and Rex had been escorted into Judge Morrison's chambers, a large, wood-paneled room that exuded quiet authority and professional competence. The judge's personal office was decorated with photographs of family members, law books organized alphabetically on floor-to-ceiling shelves, and a large mahogany desk that had probably served multiple judges over the decades. A comfortable sitting area with soft chairs and a small sofa occupied one corner, and it was to this area that Patricia Summers gently guided Emma. The court stenographer, a woman named Margaret who had been transcribing legal proceedings for over 30 years, positioned herself in an unobtrusive corner with her stenotype machine, ready to capture every word spoken during this highly irregular and confidential session. Emma, freed from the formal atmosphere of the courtroom, immediately moved toward Rex with the kind of purposefulness that suggested the dog was her primary concern and comfort. She climbed onto the soft sofa and positioned herself against Rex's side, her small body relaxing visibly as the dog's warmth and presence enveloped her. Judge Morrison settled into one of the comfortable chairs, her judicial robes arranged carefully around her, her expression still authoritative but now tempered with genuine compassion. Emma, sweetheart, I want you to know that you are in a safe place now. This room is private. It's just us and the people who care about you. Do you understand? Emma nodded, her pale blue eyes moving between the judge and Rex, clearly drawing strength from the dog's unwavering presence. I want to ask you some questions, Judge Morrison continued, her voice gentle but clear, and I want you to answer as honestly as you can. There are no wrong answers. You won't get in trouble for telling the truth. Do you understand? Yes, Emma whispered, her fingers buried in Rex's fur. Dr. Morris shifted forward slightly, her professional expertise adding another dimension to the informal gathering. Emma, can you tell Judge Morrison about some of the times when your daddy was loud? What would happen? Emma's small face crumpled with concentration and emotion. The effort of articulating trauma that she had been unable to express for months seemed to cost her physically, her tiny frame trembling slightly against Rex's steady bulk. Daddy would yell, she began slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. He would yell at Mommy. He would say bad words. He would say Mommy was stupid. He would say she was trying to take me away from him. Emma paused, her eyes glistening with tears that threatened to spill over. He would yell at me too. He would say I was being bad. He would say I was stupid and didn't listen and was a bad girl. Patricia Summers leaned forward, offering a tissue box to the small child, but Emma waved it away, preferring to continue communicating. What would happen when he yelled at you? Dr. Morris asked carefully, her tone suggesting that she was asking for clinical information rather than trying to extract sensational details. He would grab my arm, Emma said, and at this point she instinctively pulled up the sleeve of her dress, revealing skin that still bore faint traces of bruising, finger-shaped marks that told their own story. He would squeeze and shake me. He would tell me I had to listen to him, that I had to respect him, that Mommy was trying to steal me. Judge Morrison's expression hardened. She had suspected this, but hearing it articulated by the child herself was different from reading clinical reports or psychological evaluations. This was raw truth, unfiltered and devastating in its simplicity. Emma, the judge said carefully, can you tell me about the times when the dog was there? What happened then? Emma's entire demeanor changed. Her expression, which had been anxious and strained, shifted into something resembling peace. Her fingers, which had been clenching and unclenching nervously, stilled against Rex's fur. She took a shaky breath. One time Daddy was really loud, she said, her voice gaining slightly more strength. He was yelling at Mommy. He was yelling so loud it scared me, and I didn't know what to do. I wanted to hide, but I was scared to move. She paused, her eyes moving to Rex. And then, the doggy came. The detective lady brought him, and he came to me. He put his head on my leg, and he stayed there. He stayed even when Daddy told him to go away. What did you feel when the dog was with you? Judge Morrison asked, her voice soft but intent. Safe, Emma said immediately, the word coming with absolute certainty. I felt safe. I didn't feel so scared. I didn't feel so alone. Dr. Morris exchanged a meaningful glance with Judge Morrison. What Emma was describing was not just comfort from an animal. What she was describing was the profound psychological impact of having another being recognize her distress and respond with protective presence. In the absence of her father providing safety and security, in the absence of her mother being able to fully protect her from her father's emotional abuse, the dog had filled a void that no human in her immediate environment could fill. Emma, Patricia Summers said gently, what happened after the detective lady and the doggy left? How did you feel? Emma's face crumpled again, tears now flowing freely down her small cheeks. I was sad. I wanted the doggy to stay. I wanted him to come back. Because when he wasn't there, Daddy would yell again, and Mommy would cry, and I would be scared again. Did you tell anyone about wanting the dog to come back? Dr. Morris asked. I told Mommy, Emma said. I told her I wanted the doggy, and Daddy heard me and he got really mad, he said. Emma's voice dropped to barely audible levels. He said the dog was trying to steal me from him. He said I wasn't allowed to love the dog. He said if I talked about the dog again, he would. He would. It's okay, Emma, Patricia Summers interjected gently. You don't have to say what he threatened. We understand. You're being very brave. Judge Morrison sat very still, her weathered face a study in controlled emotion. She had presided over hundreds of cases involving allegations of child abuse, had seen the statistical evidence of the long-term psychological damage that resulted from childhood trauma, had witnessed the ripple effects of parental abuse extend through multiple generations. But there was something about hearing it articulated directly by the child. Something about witnessing Emma's small frame shaking with emotion as she described her father's behavior. That brought the abstract concept of abuse into visceral, undeniable reality. Emma, the judge said finally, her voice thick with emotion that she was struggling to contain, I want you to know that what your daddy did was not okay. You are not a bad girl. You are not stupid. You did nothing wrong. When grown-ups yell at children and hurt them, that is the grown-up's fault, not the child's. Do you understand? Emma nodded, but her expression suggested that, while she could hear the judge's words, truly believing them would take considerably longer than a single conversation in a judge's chambers. Judge Morrison turned to Dr. Morris. Doctor, in your professional opinion, what does Emma need to begin healing from this trauma? Dr. Morris took a moment before responding, choosing her words with careful precision. Emma needs several critical things. First and foremost, she needs to be removed from the environment where the abuse is occurring. She needs to be placed in the care of a parent who is prioritizing her emotional well-being and her healing rather than her own need for control. Second, she needs consistent, ongoing professional therapy to process what she has experienced and to develop healthy coping mechanisms. Third, she needs to understand consistently and repeatedly that her feelings are valid, that her preferences matter, and that loving others, whether people or animals, is something to be encouraged rather than punished. The psychologist paused, her eyes moving to Emma, then back to the judge. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly, Emma needs continuity of positive relationships. The dog has become, whether intentionally or not, a therapeutic presence for her. Continuing to facilitate that relationship, at least in the short term, could be enormously beneficial to her healing process. Judge Morrison nodded slowly, absorbing every word, every implication. She looked at Rex, who had remained throughout this entire session in a posture of quiet, alert protection, his body positioned so that Emma could lean against him, his eyes moving occasionally between Emma and the judge, his presence communicating a wordless understanding of the gravity of what was occurring. "I believe we have what we need," Judge Morrison said finally. "We will reconvene in the courtroom in 15 minutes. Margaret, you will ensure that the transcript of this session is sealed and available only to myself and legal counsel for the parties involved. This information will inform my ruling, but it will not be made public in order to protect Emma's privacy and dignity." As the group prepared to return to the courtroom, Emma wrapped her arms around Rex's neck one final time, whispering something into his fur that only the dog could hear. Whatever she said, it seemed to settle something within her, a small measure of peace in a situation that had been chaotic and frightening for far too long. The courtroom had taken on an entirely different atmosphere when the proceedings reconvened. The energy that had previously been tense and uncertain now carried an undercurrent of inevitability. Judge Morrison had returned to her elevated position behind the bench, her expression grave and resolute in a way that suggested a decision had been made, not hastily, but with the kind of certainty that comes from witnessing undeniable truth. The gallery remained packed with spectators, reporters, and interested parties, all sensing that they were about to witness a turning point in this case. Richard Pemberton had clearly spent the recess attempting damage control. He and Marcus had conferred extensively, and the defense strategy had shifted noticeably. Gone was the confident aggression that had characterized the morning's proceedings. In its place was a more cautious, defensive posture, the body language of a legal team attempting to salvage what remained salvageable of an increasingly indefensible position. Judge Morrison looked directly at Marcus Hartwell, her penetrating gray eyes seeming to read the innermost depths of his character. "Mr. Hartwell, you are still under oath from your earlier testimony. I would like to ask you some additional questions based on information that has emerged during these proceedings. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist in Portland sunlight. His expensive suit, which had looked sharp and commanding at the beginning of the day, now seemed to hang on him like an ill-fitting costume. His face had paled considerably, and a thin sheen of perspiration was visible on his forehead despite the courtroom's cool temperature. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no deception or evasion. "During the initial welfare check conducted by Detective Chen 3 months ago, your daughter Emma displayed a strong emotional response to the presence of the police dog. Can you describe what you observed during that interaction?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his attorney leaning toward him and whispering something urgent that seemed to be a warning rather than advice. Marcus cleared his throat, attempting to project a composure he clearly no longer felt. "Well, Your Honor, she seemed to like the dog," Marcus said carefully, his words measured and calculated. "Kids like animals, It's not unusual. Did you attempt to discourage that interaction? Judge Morrison pressed forward, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. I may have suggested that she not get too close to a police dog, Marcus replied, his voice becoming slightly defensive. I was concerned about her safety. Police dogs are working animals, not pets. Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with the intensity of a prosecutor closing in on a witness whose testimony was crumbling. And why, Mr. Hartwell, would you be concerned about your daughter's safety with a police dog that was being handled by a trained law enforcement officer? Marcus's jaw clenched visibly. His hands, which had been resting on the defense table, suddenly formed into fists. The muscle in his cheek began to twitch, a tell that suggested his carefully constructed facade was beginning to fracture under pressure. I don't appreciate the implication, Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. I was being a responsible parent, concerned about his daughter's welfare. Were you? Judge Morrison asked, her voice cold and cutting. Or were you attempting to prevent your daughter from forming an attachment to something or someone outside of your direct control? The courtroom erupted into barely suppressed reactions. Several spectators gasped audibly. Jennifer Hartwell's hands flew to her mouth, and fresh tears began streaming down her face. Even some of the reporters seemed to recognize that they were witnessing a judicial confrontation of significant intensity. Richard Pemberton stood abruptly. Your Honor, I must object to this line of questioning. The judge is making accusations rather than asking legitimate questions. This is inappropriate and prejudicial. Judge Morrison's gavel came down with such force that it seemed to shake the entire courtroom. Sit down, Mr. Pemberton. I will conduct this examination as I see fit. Your objections are noted for the record, but they will not prevent me from pursuing legitimate lines of inquiry. The judge's attention returned to Marcus, and the intensity of her focus seemed to physically push him back into his seat. Mr. Hartwell, I have information suggesting that during the past 6 months, you have engaged in a pattern of behavior toward your daughter that includes yelling, grabbing, threatening, and psychological intimidation. I have information suggesting that you have explicitly told your daughter that she is not permitted to form attachments to others outside of your household. I have information suggesting that you have characterized the police dog as a threat to your relationship with your daughter. How do you respond to these allegations? Marcus's face had transformed into something almost unrecognizable. The color had drained completely from his features, leaving him looking almost cadaverous. His lips had gone white, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid, the physical manifestations of someone experiencing significant psychological distress. Those are lies, Marcus said, but his voice had lost all conviction. It was the response of someone who understood that the evidence against him was overwhelming and that denial had become futile. I love my daughter. I would never intentionally harm her. Intentions are irrelevant, Mr. Hartwell, Judge Morrison said coldly. What matters is impact, and the impact of your behavior on your daughter is documented, observable, and deeply troubling. The judge paused, allowing her words to settle into the record with the weight they deserved. I have just concluded a private session with your daughter, with her child advocate, with a clinical psychologist, and with the police officer and her dog who were present during the initial welfare check. During that session, Emma articulated, without prompting or coaching, a pattern of emotional abuse that she has been subjected to in your presence and under your care. Marcus made an inarticulate sound, something between a protest and a groan, but before he could formulate a response, the judge continued. Your daughter described incidents of yelling, physical grabbing, threatening behavior, and psychological intimidation. Your daughter displayed visible bruising on her small body that is consistent with the pattern of abuse she described. Your daughter articulated with profound clarity that she feared you and that she felt safe only in the presence of another being, the police dog, who recognized her distress and responded with protection rather than harm. Judge Morrison's expression had taken on the kind of stern authority that suggested she was reaching the conclusions that would form the foundation of her ruling. Furthermore, I have reviewed communications between you and associates that suggest you view your daughter not as a child requiring nurturing and protection, but as a possession to be controlled, disciplined, and dominated. I have reviewed the reports from her preschool indicating behavioral changes consistent with trauma responses. I have reviewed the testimony of her pediatrician indicating bruising inconsistent with normal childhood accidents. And I have witnessed, with my own eyes, your daughter's spontaneous identification of a dog as a source of safety and protection, an identification that is only necessary because the adults who should be providing that safety have failed catastrophically. Marcus was visibly shaking now, his entire frame vibrating with emotion so intense it seemed likely to overwhelm him completely. Richard Pemberton had placed a hand on his client's arm, whether in support or to prevent him from doing something that would further damage his case was unclear. "I have a question for you, Mr. Hartwell," Judge Morrison said, and her voice had taken on a quality that suggested this question was the culmination of everything that had come before. "When your daughter told you that she wanted the police dog to return, when she expressed affection for that dog, when she demonstrated that the dog had provided her with something she could not find in her own home, did you facilitate that connection? Did you recognize that your daughter had found a source of comfort and safety, and did you support that? Or did you punish her for that attachment?" Marcus opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. His attorney leaned over and whispered something that seemed to be instruction to remain silent. Marcus nodded jerkily, his earlier bravado completely evaporated, replaced by the shell-shocked expression of someone who had just realized the full magnitude of the consequences bearing down upon him. "I think your silence is more eloquent than any words you could offer," Judge Morrison said grimly. "The evidence in this case paints a clear and devastating picture of a parent who has prioritized control over his daughter's well-being, who has used intimidation and physical punishment to establish dominance, and who has actively punished his daughter for forming attachments to sources of safety and support outside of his direct control." The judge adjusted her position slightly, her judicial robes settling around her as she prepared to deliver what seemed like preliminary conclusions that would form the foundation of her ultimate ruling. "However, before I make my final determinations regarding custody, I want to hear from Detective Chen regarding her observations and her professional assessment of the situation. Detective, would you please return to the witness stand?" Sarah Chen, who had remained seated in the gallery with Rex at her side, rose and made her way back to the witness stand. The dog remained perfectly composed, his movements measured and calm, his presence itself seeming to have a settling effect on the courtroom's turbulent emotional atmosphere. As Sarah was being sworn back in, Judge Morrison's gray eyes returned to Marcus Hartwell one final time, and in that gaze was communicated a message of absolute clarity. The judge had seen through his facade, understood his motivations, and recognized the threat he posed to his daughter's well-being. The legal machinery of justice, which had seemed uncertain just hours before, now moved with inevitable purpose toward a conclusion that seemed increasingly predetermined. Detective Sarah Chen took her position in the witness stand once more, her hand instinctively reaching down to stroke Rex's head as she settled into her seat. The dog had positioned himself directly beside her, his body language communicating unwavering support and partnership. Judge Morrison looked at the detective with an expression that suggested she was about to ask questions that would serve as the final building blocks in constructing her legal ruling. "Detective Chen," Judge Morrison began, her voice steady and measured, "based on your extensive investigation into this matter, based on your professional experience with countless cases involving families and children, and based on your partnership with Rex and the insights that partnership has provided, What is your professional assessment of Mr. Hartwell's suitability as a custodial parent? Sarah took a moment before responding, understanding the weight and significance of her words. She had testified in court hundreds of times, but this testimony felt different. It felt like the culmination of a professional journey that had led her to this precise moment, to this precise courtroom, to this precise child who needed an adult to speak truth on her behalf. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice clear and professional, "in my 17 years as a law enforcement officer, I have investigated numerous cases involving child abuse and family conflict. I have witnessed patterns of behavior that indicate when a parent is prioritizing their own needs over their child's welfare. And I have developed an ability to recognize warning signs that suggest a child is in danger, not just physical danger, but psychological and emotional danger as well." She paused, gathering her thoughts, ensuring that every word would be precise and meaningful. "What I observed in the Hartwell household during my initial welfare check, and what has been articulated by Emma during these proceedings, indicates a systematic pattern of emotional abuse designed to control and dominate a child. The bruising on Emma's body, the behavioral changes documented by her preschool, the anxiety responses she displays, the hypervigilance regarding her father's emotional state, all of these are consistent with a child who has been subjected to abuse by a primary caregiver." Sarah's eyes moved briefly to Emma, who was sitting quietly at her small table, her hand still extended toward Rex, maintaining physical contact with the dog even from a distance. "Furthermore, Your Honor, I believe that Mr. Hartwell's reaction to Emma's formation of an attachment to Rex is particularly revealing. When a parent punishes a child for forming healthy attachments to sources of safety and support, that parent is demonstrating a need for absolute control that transcends normal parental authority. That is a red flag indicating that the parent's needs are superseding the child's needs." Richard Pemberton attempted to stand and object, but Judge Morrison silenced him with a glance that could have frozen lava. "I would not recommend that Mr. Hartwell maintain unsupervised custody of Emma," Sarah concluded. "The risk to her psychological well-being is too significant. However, I would recommend that he have access to supervised visitation only, contingent upon his participation in parenting counseling and psychological evaluation." Judge Morrison nodded slowly, absorbing this testimony. She then looked at the court stenographer. "Margaret, please ensure that the complete record of these proceedings, including the sealed private session, is preserved for the appellate record. I am about to issue my ruling." The judge settled back in her chair, her hands folded on the bench before her. The courtroom had become absolutely silent. Not even the sound of breathing seemed to disturb the air. Everyone present understood that they were about to hear a judicial decision that would reshape the life of a small child. "I have presided over the Oregon family court system for nearly 2 decades, Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying the weight of experience and authority. "I have seen countless cases involving custody disputes, parental allegations, and the painful dissolution of family relationships. But I have rarely, if ever, witnessed a case where the evidence of child abuse was presented so clearly, so compellingly, and so undeniably by the child herself." The judge's eyes moved from Marcus to Jennifer, then to Emma, then to Rex. "What I have witnessed in this courtroom today is a child finding her voice through an unexpected source. What I have witnessed is a small human being, despite fear and anxiety, and the psychological bonds that tie children to their parents even when those parents are causing harm, speaking truth that no amount of legal maneuvering can obscure or deny." Judge Morrison leaned forward, her expression grave and resolute. "I find, based on the preponderance of evidence, that Marcus Hartwell has engaged in a pattern of emotional abuse toward his daughter Emma. I find that his behavior has caused documented psychological harm to the child. I find that his attempts to prevent Emma from forming attachments to sources of safety and support indicate a prioritization of control over his daughter's well-being. And I find that continued unsupervised custody with Mr. Hartwell poses a significant risk to Emma's physical, emotional, and psychological development. She paused, allowing these conclusions to settle into the official record. Therefore, I am issuing the following orders. Full legal and physical custody of Emma Hartwell is awarded to her mother, Jennifer Hartwell. Mr. Hartwell is granted supervised visitation only, not to exceed 2 hours per week, to occur in a supervised visitation facility with a trained professional present. This supervised visitation is contingent upon Mr. Hartwell's participation in anger management classes, parenting education classes, and psychological evaluation. Additionally, Mr. Hartwell is ordered to pay child support in the amount of $800 per month, effective immediately. Marcus Hartwell made a sound that was somewhere between a protest and a groan, but he remained seated, his attorney whispering frantically in his ear. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, her gaze now fixed on Jennifer, I am recommending that Emma receive ongoing psychological counseling to process the trauma she has experienced. I am also recommending that Ms. Hartwell facilitate Emma's continued interaction with Detective Chen and the police dog, as this relationship has proven therapeutically beneficial to the child. The judge's expression softened slightly as she looked directly at Emma. Emma, I want you to know that you have been very brave today. You told the truth even when it was scary, and that truth has made it possible for adults to help you. You are going to be okay. You are going to live with your mommy, and you are going to have time to feel safe and happy again. Jennifer Hartwell, who had been crying throughout the proceedings, suddenly gasped and stood up, her entire body trembling. Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you so much, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion so intense it seemed likely to overwhelm her. You are welcome, Ms. Hartwell, the judge replied. Take care of your daughter. Give her the safety and love she deserves. As the courtroom erupted into the kind of emotional responses that only significant judicial rulings could produce, Emma suddenly ran toward her mother. Jennifer caught her small daughter in an embrace so fierce and protective that it seemed to communicate years of maternal worry and devotion being finally, fully expressed. They held each other, mother and daughter united at last in a way that the courts had finally authorized and protected. Detective Sarah Chen quietly gathered Rex's leash, preparing to exit the courtroom. But before she could move, Emma broke away from her mother and ran directly to the dog, throwing her small arms around Rex's neck one final time. Thank you for helping me, Emma whispered into the dog's fur. Thank you for being good. Rex's tail moved in that measured, deliberate way that suggested profound understanding. The dog pressed his head gently against Emma's small body, and in that moment, the courtroom witnessed something that transcended legal proceedings entirely. The connection between a child and an animal that had served as a bridge between trauma and healing, between silence and voice, between fear and safety. 6 months later, the Portland Park on a bright June afternoon was filled with families enjoying the return of warmer weather. Children played on grass still damp from the morning's rain, their laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. At a picnic table near the parking area, Jennifer Hartwell sat with her daughter Emma, watching as the child played with a small group of other children from her new preschool. Emma had transformed in the 6 months since the custody hearing. She was brighter, more confident, her natural childhood exuberance slowly returning as the weight of her father's emotional abuse began to lift from her small shoulders. She attended therapy once a week with Dr. Judith Morris, and while the healing process would take years, the trajectory was clearly positive. Detective Sarah Chen approached with Rex at her side, the dog moving with the same calm competence he had displayed throughout the trial. Emma saw them immediately and broke away from her playmates, running toward the dog with obvious joy and recognition. Rex, Rex, she called out, her voice clear and strong and filled with genuine happiness. You came. He always comes, Sarah said warmly, settling onto the bench beside Jennifer. Emma's become part of his routine. Jennifer watched her daughter interact with the dog, her eyes filled with a mother's gratitude and relief. "I don't know how to thank you," she said to Sarah. "What you did, what Detective Rex did, you gave my daughter her life back." Sarah smiled, stroking Rex's head as the dog accepted Emma's enthusiastic attention with patient composure. Rex didn't do anything extraordinary. He just responded to what he sensed in Emma. He recognized that she needed help, and he offered what he could: his presence, his protection, his unwavering loyalty. The detective paused, watching Emma throw her arms around the dog's neck, her small face radiant with joy. "Sometimes," Sarah continued, "that's all any of us can offer: our presence, our willingness to stand beside someone who is suffering. And sometimes that's exactly what's needed to change everything." As the afternoon sun warmed the park and Emma played with Rex, her laughter mixing with the sounds of other children's voices, the healing that had begun in that Portland courtroom continued its quiet, steady progress. The two words Emma had spoken, "good dog," had echoed through a legal system, had shattered a facade of respectability, and had given a child the opportunity to grow into the person she was meant to become. Judge Patricia Morrison, reviewing the case file weeks later, would note in her personal files that this was precisely why she had become a judge: to be present in moments when truth finally broke through deception, when children's voices could be heard and protected, and when the system, when functioning at its best, could serve justice in its purest form. And in a quiet moment one evening, as Sarah prepared her report on the case, she found herself watching video of that courtroom moment when Emma had pointed at Rex and spoken those two transformative words. She played the recording again and again, understanding that she had been present for something extraordinary, not just the legal victory, but the moment when a child found her voice, and in doing so, changed the entire trajectory of her own life and the lives of everyone who witnessed her courage. The end.